since 1995, with extra-regional activity or out-of-area operations, NATO has been at war several times. In the mid-1990s, the United States led a bombing campaign in Bosnia to prevent the Serb forces from conquering all of the Bosniak territory. We did so unilaterally without either the assistance or the knowledge from the European allies, but once the bombing campaign was over and a cold balance was created between Bosnian Serbs on one side, Croats and Bosniaks on the other, a very large NATO contingent, 60,000 troops, including 20,000 Americans, arrived in Bosnia to keep a very cold peace for the long term. And they are still there in Bosnia, in much smaller number, of course, but Bosnia remains relatively stable. A few years later, in 1999, NATO forces, 10 countries, bombed Serbia as a result of its aggressive actions towards its own republic. It's called Kosovo. This was a 78-day bombing campaign that was directed towards Serbian military forces, infrastructure, and even political campaign headquarters in downtown Belgrade. It was a wholly and completely unnecessary campaign because at the end of it, we basically accepted a Russian peace proposal that had been made before the bombing campaign began. Afghanistan was the first true NATO war in response to the attacks against the United States on September 11, 2001. As you can see from Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, an armed attack against one or more NATO members shall be considered an attack against all of them. So when Al-Qaeda struck the U.S. with terror in September 2001, NATO classified that as an armed attack, and therefore NATO members were legally obligated to defend the United States and to help us in our war in Afghanistan. So it's rather interesting, isn't it, that not a single NATO member was attacked during the Cold War when the Soviet Union was the main threat. The first attack on a NATO member happened by a terrorist organization by a minor power in the world. It was last year, 2022, that a very chaotic American departure occurred in Afghanistan, bringing to an end a very painful, very expensive, and very difficult 20-year military operation in that troubled country. And then finally, NATO went to war in 2011, another ill-advised intervention. This was an American-led campaign by NATO members, bombing Libya for a number of weeks until the leadership of that country, Muammar Gaddafi, fell from power. Libya today is a very difficult place because of the fracturing of power, the large number of armed insurgents, terrorists operating on the territory of Libya. Without a strong military leadership, Libya really is in a very difficult position. Russia has to feel itself surrounded by NATO powers, and if there is a line that NATO cannot cross, if there is an area that is absolutely essential to Russian security, it would be along the western side of Belarus and Ukraine. The Russian forces moved in. Now, about 2 years it will be once you see this video. Early on, they felt the war would last maybe a couple of weeks. They would grab Kiev, the capital, in a matter of days, expand to the western portions, and control the entire country, have it fully under Moscow's thumb. That, of course, has not happened. In this graph, you can see the territorial changes that have occurred. Areas in red are ones currently under the control of Russia. Those areas in green had been under Russian control, but Ukraine has successfully pushed them out by late 2023. And a main reason for that is NATO. This is essentially a NATO proxy war against Russia. We are providing the arms, the funding, the training, the logistics, the satellite capability, and the Ukrainians are bravely fighting with those assets on the battlefield. Without Western support, without NATO assistance, it's hard to imagine that Ukraine would still be standing today. It has used those NATO assets to great effect, taking out very large numbers of Russian tanks, artillery equipment, airplanes, helicopters, and of course soldiers. The most fundamental question to ask is why? Why did Russia invade Ukraine in 2022? We can certainly blame that on Vladimir Putin. A grave miscalculation, no question about it. He did not get the quick, painless, blood-free victory that he anticipated. But really, he was in the same category as Western intelligence, because in the United States and Western Europe, the consensus was that Russia would win this war very, very quickly. But certainly Vladimir Putin's worldview, his desire to recreate the old Soviet Union, played a central role in this decision, and history will not treat him very well when it comes to writing his biography. Russian strategic needs, that need to control Ukraine and Belarus, not to mention Georgia, certainly played a role in the calculations. The expectation that the U.S. would not respond with great force because of the rise of the America First mindset in the United States. And then finally, at least some of the responsibility has to go to the decision to enlarge NATO, to effectively encircle Russia with NATO forces. NATO, since the invasion in 2022, has been very careful. A delicate balancing act has been undertaken. If we apply too little pressure, provide too little support for Ukraine, Russia may ultimately win this war. And if we push the envelope too far, there's the very real prospect of a Russia-NATO direct military engagement. So we've largely been threading the needle between the two thresholds, keeping Ukraine afloat and avoiding a direct NATO engagement with the Russian Red Army. So far, so good. As we think about the future of NATO, certainly the enlargement that has happened historically gives us a trajectory. It gives us an idea of where things are going. An original 12 members became 16 by 1986, and ultimately the Cold War's end. In the post-Cold War era, through a series of enlargements, 3, then 7, 2, 1, and finally Northern Macedonia joined during the Trump administration to bring that number to 30. In 2023, we've had, of course, 1, and then now we expect 2 with Finland and Sweden. Moving forward, at least 4 nations are what we call aspiring NATO members. They want to join. They're in the process of getting ready. NATO, of course, has to endorse them. But there is the very real possibility that NATO will reach the mid-30s within a handful of years ahead. It is possible that NATO ultimately ends up here, Belarus, Ukraine, all of it, maybe Georgia as well, as being members. This would take NATO right to the edge of Russia's boundary with Europe. Is this in America's interest? Is this in NATO's interest? Is this going to stabilize Europe? Or will this force the Russians to lash out militarily once again? Is it possible that we botch this current policy? That we find ourselves unable to maintain enough pressure to keep Ukraine afloat, but not overcooking it so as to engage the Russians directly? Well, U.S. politics will certainly play a role in that, and the ongoing political war happening in the Republican Party gives rise to some concerns. Because when this war began, there was bipartisan support for American and NATO military aid to Ukraine. And if there were any complaints, they were that the Biden administration was too conservative, going too slowly, not authorizing tanks or long-range missiles or advanced deep threat fighter planes. That all has changed in the last year or so, as a significant portion of the Republican Party has begun to question the utility, the usefulness, the logic of supplying military armaments to Ukraine. And that battle within the Republican Party has gone so far as to throw the House into disarray. For about 3 weeks in the fall of 2023, the House of Representatives couldn't function because its speaker had gone down to an internal revolt. It was not until the 4th candidate was finally approved that the House of Representatives began to function. We have to worry about aid to Ukraine. The ongoing war in Israel has led to a decision by many in Congress that we need to separate the request, that Israeli military aid should be considered first and then Ukrainian military aid thereafter. So there is a domestic political battle happening that is jeopardizing NATO and U.S. aid to Ukraine. What is for certain about the future of NATO is that it won't be what it was in the past. Because of the war in Ukraine, NATO has fundamentally redirected its strategy towards protecting its member states. In the old days, which means 1949 till 2022, NATO operated on a principle called deterrence through retaliation. You can see the member states of NATO during the Cold War and up until the admission of Finland and Sweden. Very modest numbers of NATO forces were on the Russian boundary. In the event that Russia invaded one of them, it would capture territory. That would result in an American mobilization of military forces, the arrival of U.S. forces, and frankly, we would blow the Russians out of region. We would liberate NATO allies that had been invaded, and we would liberate all of the territory that had fallen under Russian control. That is no longer the modus operandi of NATO because of the horrors we have seen in Ukraine, where Russians are violating every basic ethic of warfare, every law of armed conflict, even kidnapping children by the thousands and deporting them out of Ukraine. We're now going to go with a deterrence through denial. Rather than having modest forces, a plate glass window effect, we're going to go with very large NATO capabilities to prevent the Russians from occupying even 1 square inch of NATO soil, given their tendency towards brutality. So this is going to alter the way that NATO is structured, the way that NATO deploys forces, and of course it's a very different deterrent for Moscow and its calculations moving forward. So what are U.S. foreign policy options? First of all, we should note that NATO is both a cost and a benefit to the United States. Since we are the dominant actor and our decisions will have an enormous impact on the future of NATO, we should recognize both the positive and the negative. And the problems are there. NATO legally binds the United States to defending other nations. The number of those nations we must defend is getting larger seemingly every era. It allows pretty wealthy countries like Germany and France and Italy to be free riders, not making the 2% suggested budget allocation to military forces, as is the United States. And it also forces Russia into a corner. It has to make the Russians nervous that NATO isn't just about deterring Russia, but it may be a forward positioning of forces to someday invade the Russian Federation. At the same time, NATO serves many of our interests. It does make it much harder for isolationists to take power in the United States and affect U.S. foreign policy. Mr. Trump used to talk about NATO should perhaps be ended, and yet it was under his presidency that Northern Macedonia was added as a member of NATO. It promotes peace within the bloc. We don't think about Germany v. Italy v. France any longer, even though that was the core of the Second World War. It does stay the hand of Russia. Russia's invaded both Georgia and Ukraine, but do note neither of them was a member of NATO. And finally, it gives our diplomacy a very strong backdrop, having that NATO power to reference at any time. 3 main foreign policy choices for us. There is, of course, the status quo, just allowing NATO to continue to slowly enlarge, to march towards the east. There could be more significant growth. There are other countries, even outside of region. Some people have talked about possibly Israel as a future member of the NATO alliance. We could go in a completely different direction and talk about different triggers for NATO responses. Currently, NATO believes that it is an armed military attack that triggers NATO's collective defenses. But we've learned things from the Ukraine war. Russia's military assault on nuclear facilities in Ukraine fortunately did not cause an ecological disaster. But what if they had? What if that toxic cloud had formed and spread across NATO members? Would that be considered to be an attack on NATO? Some NATO members made that argument in an effort to deter Russian assaults on the nuclear facilities. Or perhaps the U.S. is going to start debating even the utility of NATO. Political realists argue that NATO is critical because we're allowed to align with countries that share our strategic interest in deterrence of a powerful and dangerous force. But the America Firsters have argued Russia's not that big of a threat. NATO's a big waste of money. We should not spend American blood and treasure on countries that very few Americans could identify on a blank map of Europe. So we should rethink our commitment to the NATO alliance. A lot of major decisions will have to be made immediately, of course, on Ukraine, long term as it relates to NATO. There's been talk of pulling out. Mr. Trump has made that statement during his 2024 campaign run. And Mr. Bolton, who was the national security advisor to Mr. Trump, said without question, the U.S. would withdraw from NATO should Mr. Trump win election. Some of his compatriots in the Republican Party, those running against him, have also endorsed the idea of removing the United States from the NATO alliance. Congress has responded both in the House and the Senate by passing legislation to put up roadblocks to such an effort to remove the U.S. from NATO membership. Having said that, these are our three basic choices beyond the current status quo approach to NATO. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, stay engaged and make great decisions.